On some summers when I was a child, I lived and worked on my uncle's farm in Johnston County, North Carolina. I considered it a vacation. Now, my uncle saw me as an additional farmhand. On Saturdays, chores centered around the house, things like mowing the lawn. Saturday was also the day when a man in a pickup truck would stop by the mailbox. My uncle would walk to the road, and the two men would stand and talk. Now, my cousins and I knew that we were not to interrupt adults, so we waited as long as we could, and then walked to the road to the two men. The man talking to my uncle would smile, greet us, ask us our names, pat us on the head. And then, quite often, he would give each of us a 50-cent piece. Now, in a time when a full day of work in a tobacco field paid $3, 50 cents was a great deal of money. The man's name was Percy Flowers. Today is the 19th Sunday in Ordinary Time, and the readings today speak about the voice of God, challenging us to identify and respond to God's voice in a world of many voices. The first reading from the book of Kings brings our attention to how God's voice might be imagined or heard. Through Elijah, we learn that things we hear may or may not be the voice of God. Elijah has traveled to Mount Horeb, also known as Mount Sinai. Elijah has defeated and killed the prophets of Baal, and King Ahab is seeking to kill him. But before God will tell Elijah how he will serve God, God tells him to stand at the opening of a cave to identify God when he passes by. There is wind, then earthquake, then fire. Elijah does not hear God in those sounds. Then there is a tiny whispering. Elijah recognizes that this is the voice of God. Joshua Percy Flowers was born in 1903. He lived on a 10,000-acre family farm near Clayton, North Carolina, called the Pineville Plantation. During the Great Depression, Mr. Flowers, as he was known, began purchasing land to raise tobacco and corn. He eventually owned an additional 5,000 acres, and he supported at least 22 sharecropping families. And Mr. Flowers had another talent. He made illegal liquor. In the second reading today, Paul writes to the Romans, there's been a dispute in the Jewish community between those who have accepted Jesus as the Messiah and the traditional Jewish community. In the short portion that we hear today, Paul is grieving for the Israelites who will not hear the good news of the Messiah and are cut off from Christ. During his moonshining days, it is said that Percy Flowers made $1 million a year from the sale of bootleg whiskey. He had stills throughout his own farmland and, some believe, on other farms in the county. He was indicted 10 times by federal grand juries and charged with state and local crimes 18 times. yet he seldom spent any time in jail. In 1958, the Saturday Evening Post published a profile of Percy Flowers, calling him the king of the moonshiners. In the gospel today, Jesus sends the disciples ahead of him so that he might have time to pray. Then, between 3 and 6 the next morning, the disciples see Jesus walking towards them on the water. They are terrified until they hear his voice. Then Peter is so bold as to ask Jesus if he might also walk on the sea. And Jesus speaks and invites him to do so. Peter is fine until he opens his own mouth, expressing his fear of what he is doing. And Jesus saves him. And he reminds Peter that having faith in Jesus' voice would prevent him from sinking. Now, Percy Flowers was not just a bootlegger. Throughout his life, he provided for families in need in Johnston County, people in financial trouble or in crisis. One article about him said that he was a pillar of the White Oak Baptist Church. He was known to give large donations to the church. Other writings of the time described him as a philanthropist. My uncle spoke about Percy Flowers as a good man, an important man around here, someone you want as a friend. In the Old Testament, we hear God's voice described as being loud as thunder, as powerful as an earthquake, or so scorching that it burns up everything in its path like fire. Then, to Isaiah, God's voice is a whisper. In that account, the thunder, the earthquake, the fire are not God's voice. So what are we to make of it? Discerning God's voice in our life is a major task associated with finding our calling and our purpose in life. Often that discernment is hampered by the noise around us. The noise in the world urges us to purchase, to eat, to belong, and to believe things that the world values or sells. These things are often not things of God, and God's voice is not in them. Percy Flowers provides us something to consider when we wonder if we are hearing and following the voice of God. Percy Flowers made his fortune in an illegal business. He was a pillar of his church. He provided for his neighbors, especially those who could not provide for themselves. He was a hero to many in Johnston County. If we consider Jesus' quiet scolding of Peter, we might wonder if Percy Flowers heard the same scriptural passage that we heard today. And unlike Peter, he stood firm in his faith, believing that his faith would finally bring him to the purpose that God intended for him. If we can accept that premise, then it follows that we too can hold to our faith, constantly listening in prayer and responding, knowing that God's voice will guide us to accomplish God's work. Percy Flowers died in 1982. His wife, Dell, began the transition of the Flowers plantation into a master plan community in 1997. That plan includes almost 8,000 family and commercial units, agricultural uses, and naturalized spaces. Today, the Flowers Plantation has 5,000 residents. It can be our prayer this week that each time we ask ourselves if we are hearing and following the voice of Jesus, that we remind ourselves of the quiet reassurance of Jesus to Peter. You of little faith, why do you doubt?